The word just in this headline is doing a lot of heavy lifting it genuinely hasn't earned, and I want to correct that right away before we go any further. What you're about to see described did happen, and it's honestly one of the most historically significant naval actions in 80 years. But it didn't just happen, not in any sense that would make this breaking news today. It happened back in early March, months ago. Let me actually walk you through what this event really was, because once you understand it correctly, you won't need an exaggerated timestamp to feel how big a deal this genuinely is. Former combat fighter pilot here, years flying the F-15E in actual combat operations, time as a Thunderbird pilot after that, years flying commercial jets once my time in the fighter community wrapped up for good. Submarine warfare specifically isn't my own background, and I want to be upfront about that limitation right away. But understanding military escalation more broadly, historical precedent, and what an action like this actually signals strategically, absolutely, is something I can add real value to. And that's exactly what I want to break down carefully for you today. Let's start with the challenge part of this headline, because it's not describing one single dramatic confrontation, it's describing a pattern that's been going on for years. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has a long, well-documented history of what the U.S. military repeatedly calls unsafe and unprofessional behavior toward American vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz in the broader Persian Gulf. In 2021, Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said 13 IRGC boats approached 7 American vessels at high speed, closing within 140 meters, before one U.S. ship fired warning shots to make them break off. In 2022, video showed IRGC Navy craft operating dangerously close to the patrol ship USS Sirocco and the transport vessel USNS Choctaw County for a full hour before finally departing. This kind of high-speed approach, sometimes with weapons visible, sometimes accompanied by radio harassment, has been part of the pattern in these waters for years, going back well before this current war ever started. And that's exactly the kind of behavior most serious naval analysts and defense correspondents point to when they talk about Iran routinely challenging the U.S. Navy's ongoing presence throughout the region. This kind of pattern actually goes back even further than those 2 specific incidents. Back in 2017, the Pentagon publicly countered an Iranian claim that a U.S. carrier had fired warning shots at one of its vessels, with Navy spokesman Ian McConaughey describing several IRGC naval vessels approaching American forces at high speed near the USS Nimitz without responding to attempts at communication. These encounters have followed a remarkably consistent shape across nearly a decade now, small, fast IRGC boats closing distance rapidly on much larger American vessels, American forces attempting to establish radio contact, and the interaction either de-escalating on its own or, in a smaller number of cases, ending with American forces firing warning shots specifically to force separation. That's the actual texture of what naval challenge has meant in these waters for the better part of the last decade. Repeated, tense, occasionally dangerous encounters that generally stopped short of anyone actually being killed, right up until this current war changed that calculus entirely. So when this current war actually broke out on February 28th of this year, that backdrop of years of tense, provocative encounters was already sitting right underneath everything that followed. The United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran that day, and one of the stated American objectives from the very beginning was described in blunt terms by senior military leadership: dismantling Iran's naval capability in the region entirely. Now here's the part of this headline that's actually true, genuinely extraordinary, and worth explaining in full detail, even though it's not new. On March 4th, a United States Navy fast attack submarine, later widely reported and confirmed to be the Los Angeles-class boat USS Charlotte, fired a single torpedo that struck and sank an Iranian frigate in the Indian Ocean, roughly 2,000 miles from Iran's own coastline. Iran identified the vessel as the Iris Dana, confirming its identity publicly within hours of the sinking becoming known. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirmed the strike personally at a Pentagon press briefing shortly afterward, using notably blunt, deliberately memorable language for the occasion, saying an American submarine sunk an Iranian warship that thought it was safe in international waters, and describing it simply as a quiet death. Let me give you a little more technical context on how this kind of attack actually works, because I think it helps explain both the tactical significance and why the target had essentially no realistic chance to defend itself. American fast attack submarines like the Los Angeles class typically carry the Mark 48 torpedo, a heavyweight, wire-guided weapon specifically engineered to defeat both surface ships and other submarines with a very high probability of a lethal, mission-ending hit once successfully launched and tracking correctly toward its intended target. A submerged submarine operating quietly is extraordinarily difficult for a surface vessel to detect using standard sonar and surveillance methods, especially one that isn't actively expecting to be hunted in the first place. That combination, stealth approach plus a single extremely lethal weapon, is exactly why submarine attacks on surface ships have historically been treated as such a severe, almost unanswerable form of naval warfare. There is essentially no defensive countermeasure available to a surface vessel once a torpedo has already been fired and is inbound. Here's why this specific naval action carries so much genuine historical weight, more than a typical wartime strike normally would. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stated plainly that this marked the first time since World War II that a United States Navy submarine had sunk an enemy combatant ship using a torpedo. To put that in real perspective, the last comparable submarine kill of an enemy warship was the USS Torsk sinking a Japanese frigate on August 14, 1945, hours before Japan's surrender ended the war entirely. A genuinely poignant historical bookend, given that this current strike, 81 years later, almost to the exact same time of year, would go on to reopen that same specific category of naval warfare after such an extraordinarily long gap. In the 80-plus years between that moment and this past March, the only genuinely comparable submarine attacks on enemy surface combatants anywhere in the world were a Pakistani submarine sinking an Indian frigate back in 1971, and the British Royal Navy's sinking of the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano during the Falklands War in 1982. That's the actual company this action belongs in historically, an extremely short, extremely rare list of submarine-on-surface ship kills spanning the entire second half of the 20th century and into today. I want to spend a moment on each of those two historical comparisons individually, because I think they're each genuinely fascinating on their own terms and help contextualize just how rare this category of naval action actually is. The sinking of the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano by the British submarine HMS Conqueror during the Falklands War remains one of the most analyzed and debated naval engagements of the late 20th century. Partly because the Belgrano was reportedly sailing away from the exclusion zone British forces had declared around the islands at the moment it was struck, a controversy with real echoes in the questions being raised about the Dana's own activity at the time it was sunk. The 1971 sinking during the India-Pakistan War, meanwhile, happened during a much shorter, more contained conflict, and received comparatively little international attention at the time compared to how closely covered and immediately controversial the Belgrano sinking became. Placing the Dana sinking alongside those two specific historical episodes, rather than just citing a vague statistic about rarity, actually tells you a lot about the kind of scrutiny and debate a submarine attack on a surface combatant tends to generate almost by its very nature as a naval action. Quick thing before we go further into exactly what happened and the genuine controversy surrounding it, because I think it honestly matters more than most coverage of this story has given it credit for. Follow now if you want the full, accurate picture here, because there's a real seriously contested question about the circumstances of this specific sinking that deserves considerably more attention and nuance than it's actually gotten in most of the coverage I've seen. Let's talk about what the Dana was actually doing when it went down in those final moments, because this is exactly where the story gets meaningfully more complicated than a simple, clean combat narrative might otherwise suggest. According to Indian government sources, the Dana had just finished participating in Milan 2026, a large multinational naval exercise hosted by India that included ships from 18 countries and aircraft from 3 more, including the United States itself. Social media footage from just 2 weeks before the sinking showed members of the Dana's crew marching in a ceremonial parade at the Indian port of Visakhapatnam. In other words, this wasn't a warship actively threatening American assets. In the moment it was struck, it was a frigate transiting home from what's been described as a largely ceremonial international naval event, roughly 2,000 miles away from the actual conflict zone in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz, a distance worth sitting with for a moment because it's roughly the equivalent of the entire width of the continental United States, an enormous stretch of open ocean separating this specific ship from anything resembling an active front line in this war. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, was furious in his public response, calling it an atrocity carried out against a ship that was 2,000 miles from Iran's shores, and warning the United States would, in his words, bitterly regret the precedent it had just set. That warning itself is worth taking seriously as a data point about how this specific strike was received inside Iran's own leadership, separate entirely from questions of whether it was legally or strategically justified from the American side. A strike perceived internally as crossing some kind of meaningful new threshold tends to shape an adversary's own subsequent decision-making in ways that don't always show up immediately, sometimes influencing posture and rhetoric for months afterward, rather than triggering an immediate, obvious retaliatory response in the days right after the event itself. Sri Lanka's own foreign minister confirmed his country's Navy and Air Force responded to a distress call from the sinking vessel, with roughly 130 people believed aboard at the time, 32 ultimately rescued, and reports indicating around 104 people killed, including 20 whose remains were never recovered. Let me walk through the actual rescue effort too, because it's a genuinely notable, largely separate story from the strike itself. Sri Lanka's Navy and Air Force responded directly to the distress call, dispatching both boats and aircraft to the scene of the sinking, a genuinely significant humanitarian response, given the ship went down roughly 2,000 miles from Iran's own coastline, far outside any waters Iran's own rescue and recovery assets could realistically have reached in time. That response happened entirely independent of the broader U.S. Iran conflict. A third country's rescue services responding purely to a maritime distress signal regardless of the political and military circumstances surrounding how that ship actually came to be sinking in the first place. It's a reminder that even in the middle of an active, high-profile war, the basic maritime obligation to respond to a distress call at sea still operated exactly the way it normally would in peacetime, which I think is worth acknowledging as its own small, separate thread of basic human decency inside a much larger, darker geopolitical story unfolding around it at the exact same time. I want to sit with that specific detail for a moment because it's easy to get swept up purely in the technical and historical significance of a first, since World War II submarine kill without pausing on the actual human cost sitting underneath it. 104 sailors died in that sinking. Whatever you think about the broader strategic justification, that's a genuinely enormous loss of life from a single torpedo strike, and it deserves to be acknowledged plainly rather than treated as just a footnote to the historical trivia about submarine warfare. I think it's genuinely worth pausing here to name something directly. Whatever position you land on regarding the strategic justification for this specific strike, 104 families received news that a loved one serving in Iran's Navy wasn't coming home, in most cases without the closure of an actual recovered body to bury or mourn over properly. That's true regardless of which side of this conflict you might sympathize with more broadly, and I don't think a breakdown focused on historical firsts and legal frameworks should skip past that basic human reality just because it's uncomfortable to sit with alongside the more technically fascinating aspects of this story. So, was this actually justified as a direct response to Iran challenging the Navy, the way this headline frames it? Here's where I think the honest answer is genuinely more complicated than a clean yes or no. The Dana wasn't caught in the act of aggressively confronting American forces. At the moment it was targeted, based on everything publicly reported about its actual movements. What connects it to the broader challenge narrative is the stated American strategic objective from the outset of this war, dismantling Iran's naval power across the board, not punishing one specific provocative encounter. Chairman Kane's own comments support that broader framing directly. He specifically described this strike as demonstrating America's global reach, the ability to hunt, find, and kill what he called an out-of-area deployer, meaning any Iranian naval vessel operating anywhere in the world, not specifically vessels caught confronting U.S. ships in the Gulf at that exact moment. That's a meaningfully different justification than the headline's implied direct challenge and response narrative suggests. It's closer to a declared, sweeping campaign against an entire Navy's operational capability, wherever that Navy's ships happen to be located at any given time. I think it's worth walking through the actual legal framework underneath that broader justification a bit more, because it's genuinely more nuanced than either a simple defense of the strike or a simple condemnation of it. Under the international law of naval warfare, enemy warships generally remain lawful military targets anywhere on the high seas for the duration of an active armed conflict between the two nations involved, essentially regardless of what specific activity that ship happens to be engaged in at the precise moment it's targeted, whether that's actively threatening enemy forces or simply transiting home from a diplomatic exercise. That's a genuinely different standard than the one that applies to, say, civilian vessels, which require a much higher bar of direct participation in hostilities before they can lawfully become a target under exactly that same body of international law. A much stricter standard reflecting the fundamentally different protections civilians and civilian shipping are generally entitled to during any armed conflict between nations. Under that specific legal framework, the Dana's status as a commissioned warship belonging to a nation actively at war with the United States likely made it a lawful target regardless of its ceremonial activities in the days immediately beforehand. Where the genuine debate lives isn't necessarily over strict legality in that narrow sense. It's over questions of proportionality, strategic necessity, and whether striking a vessel 2,000 miles from the actual conflict zone, freshly returned from a largely ceremonial multinational exercise, actually served a meaningful military purpose, commensurate with the resulting loss of life, or whether it was primarily a demonstration of reach and capability that could have been achieved through other, less lethal means. There's a comparison worth drawing here to how military planners generally think about proportionality in targeting decisions more broadly. because it helps frame why this specific question doesn't have an easy answer either way. A commander weighing whether to strike a lawful military target thousands of miles from an active battlefield typically has to weigh the actual military value of eliminating that specific asset against the resources required to reach it, the risk to their own forces in executing the strike, and increasingly, the broader political and diplomatic fallout that strike is likely to generate. A single frigate, even a genuinely capable modern warship, represents a real, but relatively modest reduction in an adversary's overall naval capability on its own. The strategic value of this specific strike likely came less from removing one ship from Iran's order of battle and more from the broader deterrent message it sent to Iran's entire navy, and to any other nation watching, about the reach and lethality of American submarine forces. Whether that broader signaling value was genuinely worth the resulting loss of life and the diplomatic backlash it generated is exactly the kind of difficult judgment call that reasonable military strategists, ethicists, and international law experts, looking at that exact same set of underlying facts, can still land on genuinely different, well-reasoned conclusions about, without any of them being obviously or provably wrong. Let me put the Dana sinking into the context of just how much broader that campaign against Iran's navy actually was, because this wasn't an isolated action. According to Pentagon reporting from that same period, U.S. forces claim to have struck or destroyed more than 130 Iranian surface vessels in total during the opening weeks of this war, including 40 mine layers and 11 submarines. Independent naval analysis published around that time described Iran's IRGC Navy corvette fleet as virtually wiped out, with all 4 vessels of its most modern corvette class either severely damaged or sunk. 4 of 5 missile-capable fast attack craft were reported destroyed. On the submarine side specifically, of 11 vessels the Pentagon claimed were struck, independent open-source analysts were only able to visually confirm a smaller number through actual released imagery, which is a useful reminder that official kill counts during any fast-moving war, on any side, tend to run ahead of what's independently verifiable in the moment, even when the underlying campaign itself is genuinely real and substantial, and even when the broader strategic outcome, a devastated Iranian navy, is genuinely not in serious dispute among any of the independent sources covering this specific conflict. Let me add a bit more specific detail to that broader campaign picture, because the numbers alone don't quite convey the scale of what actually happened to Iran's naval forces during this opening phase of the war. Independent tracking of Iran's naval losses noted the IRGC Navy's corvette component in particular had been effectively eliminated as an organized fighting force, with severe damage or sinking confirmed across its entire modern corvette class, a category of ship that would normally have formed the backbone of Iran's ability to conduct sustained, coordinated operations against shipping and naval targets throughout the Gulf. Separately, U.S. Navy destroyers reportedly fired Tomahawk land attack missiles in direct support of the broader operation, while Air Force B-2 bombers struck hardened Iranian missile infrastructure with precision-guided munitions as part of the exact same coordinated campaign. That combination, submarine strikes against individual high-value vessels, destroyer-launched cruise missiles, and heavy bomber strikes against supporting infrastructure all happening within the same operational window, points to a genuinely comprehensive, deliberately layered effort aimed at collapsing Iran's ability to coordinate and sustain any meaningful naval presence in the region, rather than a series of disconnected, opportunistic individual strikes happening to land around the same general time frame. I think it's worth being honest about that gap specifically, because it applies to essentially every big number thrown around in this entire conflict. Reuters and other outlets quoted military claims of over 30 Iranian ships sunk during this period, while other official statements and briefings cited different, sometimes higher figures, depending on which official was speaking and when. That's an extremely common pattern in wartime reporting. Political and military leadership have every incentive to emphasize successes clearly and confidently, while independent ship-by-ship verification through satellite imagery or other confirmed sourcing genuinely lags behind and is often only partial. None of that means the broader campaign against Iran's navy wasn't real or wasn't devastating. The consistent picture across multiple independent sources is that it absolutely was. It just means you should hold the most precise specific numbers with a bit more caution than the most dramatic version of any single official statement might suggest. There's also a specific, symbolically loaded detail about the Dana sinking worth mentioning, because I think it tells you something about how deliberately this entire operation was framed for maximum impact. Hegseth referred to the targeted vessel using a nickname, the Soleimani, a reference to Qasem Soleimani, the senior IRGC commander killed in a 2020 American airstrike ordered during Trump's first term. Whether that nickname reflects the ship's actual informal designation within Iran's own navy, or was emphasized specifically for its symbolic resonance in the American announcement, It's exactly the kind of detail that turns a purely military action into a pointed political statement as well, tying this submarine strike directly back to one of the most significant flashpoints in the broader US-Iran relationship over the past several years. It's worth remembering just how significant that original Soleimani strike back in January 2020 was to the entire arc of US-Iran tensions leading into this current war, because it genuinely changed the trajectory of the relationship in ways that are still playing out today. Soleimani commanded the IRGC's Quds Force, the branch responsible for Iran's external paramilitary and intelligence operations across the region, and his killing was, at the time, treated as one of the most consequential and legally contested American military actions against Iran in decades, prompting direct Iranian ballistic missile retaliation against American forces in Iraq within days. Invoking his name again here, whether deliberately or as an already established informal nickname within Iran's own navy, connects this March 2026 submarine sinking directly back to that earlier flashpoint in a way that's clearly meant to resonate, reminding both American and Iranian audiences that this entire conflict didn't emerge from nowhere. It's the latest chapter in a much longer-running, deeply personal rivalry between these two governments specifically. Now, if you want to actually understand the full scope of what happened to Iran's navy across this entire war, not just this one historically significant strike, drop a comment with the word Navy below, and I'll build a dedicated follow-up specifically walking through the broader campaign in full detail, because the Dina sinking, as dramatic and as historically unprecedented as it genuinely was really just the single most notable moment inside a much larger, sustained effort that ultimately eliminated Iran's naval capability almost entirely within a matter of weeks. Let me give you my honest read on why this specific action matters strategically, beyond just its historical novelty. Submarine warfare against surface vessels had become so rare in the modern era, largely because it represents such an extreme, largely unambiguous escalation, a stealth platform delivering a lethal strike, with essentially no warning, and very little the targeted vessel could realistically do to defend itself in the moment. Choosing to employ that specific capability, rather than a surface engagement, an airstrike, or some other more conventional naval action, sends a very deliberate signal about capability and reach, exactly the message Chairman Kane's own comments about global reach and hunting out of area deployers were explicitly designed to convey. That's a strategic communication decision as much as a purely tactical one, demonstrating to Iran, and frankly to any other nation watching this conflict closely, that American submarines can locate and destroy a target essentially anywhere on the planet, not just within the immediate contested waters of the Persian Gulf itself. I think it's also worth considering how this specific action likely landed with other navies watching this conflict unfold from a distance, because the signaling here almost certainly wasn't aimed exclusively at Iran. Any nation maintaining a blue water navy, meaning a fleet capable of operating far from its own coastline, would have taken direct notice of an American submarine successfully tracking and destroying a target roughly 2,000 miles from the actual conflict zone in the middle of a large multinational naval exercise involving 18 other countries. That's a demonstration of persistent long-range tracking and strike capability that extends well beyond any single regional conflict. And it's exactly the kind of message that tends to get quietly absorbed and analyzed by naval planners in capitals far removed from the immediate US-Iran confrontation, regardless of whether those countries have any direct stake in this particular war at all, and regardless of whether they've said anything publicly about this specific strike one way or the other. I also think the controversy around the Dana's actual activity at the moment of the strike deserves to stay part of this story rather than getting smoothed over by the historical significance angle. Whether a ship returning from a ceremonial multinational naval exercise thousands of miles from an active conflict zone should be considered a legitimate wartime target is a genuine question, one that international law generally addresses through concepts like whether a vessel remains a lawful military target simply by virtue of belonging to a navy actively engaged in an ongoing war, regardless of its specific activity or location at the exact moment it struck. Reasonable people and reasonable legal analysts can and do disagree on exactly where that line sits, and I don't think this breakdown should pretend that question has one simple, universally agreed upon answer. Let me leave you with the accurate version of this story rather than the headline's compressed, misleadingly timed version. Iran's navy has genuinely challenged American vessels in the Gulf repeatedly for years, well documented, well before this current war ever began. When war broke out this year, the United States pursued and achieved a sweeping, historically significant campaign against Iran's entire naval capability, one that included sinking more than 100 vessels across multiple classes of ship. The single most dramatic, most historically unprecedented moment inside that broader campaign was the March 4th sinking of the Iris Dana, the first submarine kill of an enemy surface combatant by the U.S. Navy since World War II, A genuinely extraordinary military achievement that also came with 104 documented deaths and a real, unresolved controversy about whether the specific circumstances of that particular strike were as clearly justified as the broader war effort surrounding it. Let me add one final piece of nuance to that summary, because I think it's genuinely the most important thing to walk away with from this entire breakdown. Historical significance and moral or legal clarity aren't the same thing, and a naval action can absolutely be both genuinely unprecedented in a technical, historical sense, while still remaining a legitimately contested, debatable decision from a strategic and ethical standpoint. Treating the Dina sinking purely as a triumphant milestone, first submarine kill since World War II, full stop, flattens out exactly the kind of nuance a story like this deserves. So does treating it purely as an unambiguous atrocity without acknowledging the actual legal framework governing naval warfare between nations already at war with each other. The honest version sits somewhere in between those two extremes, a genuinely rare, historically significant military action, executed with real technical precision, against a target whose specific circumstances at the moment of the strike remain legitimately debated, and that resulted in a substantial real loss of life that deserves to be remembered alongside the historical trivia, not overshadowed by it. If this kind of breakdown helped you actually understand the real weight and complexity behind a headline that compressed months-old history into something sounding like breaking news, share it with someone who cares about naval history, military strategy, or just wants a more accurate picture of what's actually happened in this war so far, because I genuinely think this specific action deserves to be remembered accurately, as the historically unprecedented, ethically contested moment it actually was, rather than getting flattened into just another dramatic, misleadingly timed headline in an already exhausting news cycle full of them. I want to leave you with one final open question, genuinely open, because I don't think I have a confident answer to hand you. As this war continues, and as more of these kinds of historically unprecedented, individually contested actions inevitably accumulate on both sides, how should any of us actually weigh them? As a running scoreboard of dramatic military firsts, as a growing catalog of genuinely difficult ethical and legal questions that deserve real scrutiny, or as something closer to both at once, held in tension rather than resolved neatly one way or the other? I don't think there's a clean answer to that question, and I'd honestly rather leave you sitting with it than pretend a tidy conclusion exists where one genuinely doesn't, because I think that kind of manufactured resolution would actually be a disservice to how genuinely difficult this specific category of question really is. Thanks so much for sticking with a story that mixed real military history with a genuinely uncomfortable human cost, because I think both halves of that deserve equal weight, rather than letting the historical trivia crowd out the actual lives lost. I'll keep tracking how this entire naval campaign continues to develop, and I'll see you in the next breakdown.